You might have heard of Nafta, also known as the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was the first agreement of its kind and still makes the world's biggest free trade area. So, just what is it? Well, let's begin with the basics. First, it includes Canada, the US, and Mexico. It was proposed in 1992 by these guys, and it was extremely controversial. Critics feared massive job losses, with businesses packing up and moving production to Mexico. Supporters, though, they claimed that it would lead to cheaper goods, and that would lead to economic growth. In fact, it was so controversial that in the 1992 presidential election, a billionaire outsider presidential candidate shot to the top of the polls railing against it. Businessman Ross Perot. Sounds pretty familiar. But NAFTA won out in the end with Congress and then President Clinton ratifying it in 1993.
We are ready to compete, and we can win.
NAFTA is a large, incredibly complicated document, but at its core, it's pretty simple. Before NAFTA, when items were imported, they were taxed. After NAFTA, they weren't. This protects goods made domestically at the expense of consumers, since the tax on foreign products is passed down. Higher tariffs, more expensive goods, less trade. Free trade agreements like NAFTA remove those tariffs, incentivizing trade and lowering costs for consumers. Tariffs were greatly reduced at the start of the agreement in 1994 and totally eliminated by 2008. So what did NAFTA accomplish? It's not easy pinpointing the exact effects that NAFTA has had because there are many factors in how economies function, but since the agreement, U.S. trade amongst Mexico and Canada has tripled. The U.S. trade deficit with Canada and Mexico has increased significantly. But according to this congressional report, NAFTA actually hasn't had that large an effect on the U.S. economy. NAFTA only increased the U.S. GDP by a few hundredths of a percent because relative to the size of the total economy, trade with Mexico and Canada isn't that big. So the biggest question of all, how has it affected American jobs? Economists agree there's no simple answer. It's impossible to completely separate the effects NAFTA has had on the economy from other external forces like recessions, currency valuations, technological automation, and overall increases in globalization. Many U.S. manufacturing jobs have moved overseas to countries that America doesn't even have free trade agreements with, like China. Overall, domestic manufacturing has taken a spill. Trade has increased.
Mexico is the 12th largest economy in the world, a very open economy, free trade agreements with Canada, the US, and 40 some other nations. And the economic profile of Mexico is very solid and we think has a very favorable future.
Well, Mexico has great opportunity, not just today, but in the future, for various reasons that just make sense in business. Let me start with the fact that it's a very open economy. It's actually the world's most open economy as far as free trade agreements, with over 80% of the world's economy.
Why wouldn't we want to do business with our neighbors? Canada and Mexico and the United States can become, as they are, one of the largest trading blocs in the world, which will give us great leverage and great opportunities for all of our citizens. Why wouldn't we want to have a strong geopolitical relationship with our friends in Canada and our friends in Mexico to have an influence on what goes on in the Americas, which are critical to us?
But I want to start from the point that here we are in the midst of a global economic crisis, and we need all the growth we can get because that will eventually help every country be able to overcome this recession since we are so interdependent. I think it's also important to say that I think that the North American market, of which Mexico is such a central part under NAFTA, is going to remain strong. The fact that goods can be manufactured and assembled in Mexico, cutting down on transportation costs, cutting down on the carbon footprint, which will become an even more important consideration in the years ahead, means that we're going to continue to import and export.
Well, Brett, we just wrote a report on NAFTA together. What would you say are the top 3 successes of NAFTA? I think NAFTA has a huge success story connected to it. First off, it's allowed trade to be more than tripled since its advent 23 years ago when it came into force in 1994. You've seen a massive expansion in trade in goods and services between all three NAFTA members. You've also seen North America punch way above its weight as a result of the NAFTA agreement. It's allowed us to remain competitive with the rest of the world. Our exports have expanded just at the same time as we've increased the amount of trade in goods and services that flow between our countries.
I think that's a really important point. The extent to which NAFTA and participation of Mexico in NAFTA has really made North America a much more competitive place to do business than it otherwise would be the case. Who do you think has benefited the most out of NAFTA? You know, there's this conversation going on, the Americans in particular starting to talk about how NAFTA has benefited Mexico more than anybody else. What do you think about that?
I mean, the great thing about NAFTA is that it's produced benefits for all three countries and in different ways. But some studies have quantified the amount of extra income that has come from the generated trade that NAFTA has produced. And it implies that there have been substantial improvements in income that have come from NAFTA in all three countries.
I think your second point is really important, and we tend to underestimate the importance of Mexico as a market for both Canadian and U.S. exports. If you think of it over the next 10 or 20 or 30 year horizon, Mexican growth will be far more rapid than both the growth of Canada or the U.S. And I think to the extent that we can manage to keep a foothold in that market and preferential access to the Mexican market, it stands to put us a great advantage over other parts of the world. We wrote this report with an eye to the ongoing conversation about the future of NAFTA that results in large part from President Trump's approach to trade. Based on what we've already discussed, there are clearly benefits to all three member countries of NAFTA. What do you think are the prospects for renewing the agreement going forward?
Well, the great thing is that there are ways to renew the NAFTA agreement that truly do produce gains for all three member countries. To give it some context, NAFTA was never meant to be set in stone. When it was signed in 1994, it was anticipated that it would be updated at various points. And it has been amended, depending upon how you count, literally thousands of times since then. Since 1994, there are a range of things that have become part of the economic landscape of North America that didn't exist when NAFTA came into being. We have e-commerce and the internet in a way that didn't exist at that time. We've had a big boom in services trade, and we've had a lot more interest in nuancing and enhancing protection for intellectual property.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think to paraphrase you in some ways, this is a chance to make what is already a great agreement even greater.
That's right.
Well, thanks, Brett.
In recent weeks, we've asked you to tell us what you think is causing our persistently high unemployment rate and sluggish economic growth. Many of you answered with a single acronym, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The deal was engineered by the first Bush administration and passed by the Clinton administration. The idea to spur economic growth by eliminating most tariffs on exports and imports so everyone could buy products at a cheaper price. On its face, that sounds pretty good, but critics say eliminating those tariffs made the low cost of doing business abroad too attractive, and as a result, American manufacturing jobs have been decimated. Later in the broadcast, I'll be interviewing Mickey Cantor, the former U.S. trade representative who helped broker the deal with Mexico and Canada. But first, Need to Know correspondent Rick Carr has this report on how NAFTA has changed one Midwestern city.
Today, Evansville looks like the quintessential American small city, with modern corporate headquarters buildings on the downtown skyline. But in the past, it was a factory town, and one industry loomed larger than the rest. The city was the refrigerator capital of the world. Back in the 1950s, Evansville hosted college football's Refrigerator Bowl and chose a Miss Refrigeradorable. The Whirlpool plant on the city's north side provided jobs that helped a few generations of residents of the Evansville area, an estimated 50,000 of them, buy homes and raise families.
My dad, 3 uncles, 4 brothers, all worked here at the Whirlpool at one time.
Darrell Collins joined them in 1970 when Whirlpool was the region's largest employer.
I hired in Whirlpool, shortly after high school, and I figured I'd retire there.
In 2009, Darrell Collins was close to retirement. He was 58, working as president of the union local that represented Whirlpool's Evansville employees. He'd recently been through contract negotiations. The union had given in to management demands and made concessions in an effort to keep the plant open. His understanding was that the company would do that.
They were telling us they were going to hire 600 people, make Whirlpool better, more job security. People went out and bought houses and cars, thinking that was going to happen.
He was in his office at the union hall when he got a call from management.
Told me to come to the plant, said the plant's closing. And I looked at the person down there doing the bad news, and I said, what can the union do to make this not happen? You know, can we sit down and talk? He said, no, it's done. You can't work for pennies on a dollar.
After nearly 80 years, refrigerators would no longer be built in Evansville. Whirlpool shuttered the factory and transferred production to Mexico. Today, the plant is available for new development, and the old Union Hall is abandoned and up for sale. 1,100 factory.
So let's talk about Nafta, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Basically, the US, Mexico, and Canada got together and said, man, we are making it really difficult to sell our stuff to one another. Let's reduce the barriers that we put on each other's goods. That was the basic idea. Let's just make trading with one another easier. It gets blamed for a lot.
NAFTA has led to the loss of more than 680,000 jobs.
America intends to withdraw from the deal, okay? No more NAFTA. No more NAFTA.
Getting rid of NAFTA would be
no more NAFTA.
Like walking out into oncoming traffic economically. It would cripple the auto industry, which depends on moving goods across the border many times just for one part of a car. It would be horrific for the aerospace industry, which does the same thing. Our agriculture wouldn't be able to sell corn into Mexico. It would be insanely disruptive to just stop NAFTA.
I will hold on the termination. Let's see if we can make it a fair deal.
This doesn't mean that there were not winners and losers from NAFTA. There were. Non-college educated, low-skilled workers in brick making, furniture making, shoemaking. Those guys lost out. Their income went down 10 to 17% permanently after the start of NAFTA. And that's because those jobs went to Mexico. It's pretty hard to net out how many jobs were won or lost, because the ones you lost are different from the ones you gained. The ones you gained may be paying more than the ones you lost. And then you throw on top of that questions about automation and China. But when you put into context, you can't say that NAFTA was this radically job-killing, monstrous nightmare. It really wasn't. It's totally okay for economists to disagree about whether we protected the losers enough. There's a real strong argument to say we did not. The people who won, good for them. And a lot of them are shareholders in textile companies and auto companies that did well. The people who lost, some furniture maker in the South, we should have done more.
Let's talk about the economy. Here in this beautiful and great state, so many people had suffered because of NAFTA. NAFTA, remember NAFTA, what it's done to this country. Bill Clinton signed the deal, and Hillary Clinton supported the deal. North Carolina has lost nearly half of its manufacturing jobs since NAFTA went into effect. Bill Clinton also put China into the World Trade Organization, another Hillary Clinton-backed disaster. Your city of Charlotte has lost 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs since China joined the WTO, and many of these jobs were lost while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, our chief diplomat with China. She was a disaster, totally unfit for this job, totally unfit.